The drums began before the arrows, not the sharp, martial thunder of a Roman kettle drum you might imagine from a battlefield. No, this was something different entirely. Something wrong. A low, groaning resonance rising from the flat, shimmering earth in every direction at once, like the desert itself had learned to moan. The hollow booming of Parthian war drums, their bronze-studded hides stretched tight, striking a tone so alien, so deeply unsettling, that Plutarch would later write it confounded men's very souls. Legionaries who had stood against Gallic war cries and the screaming charge of Germanic tribesmen felt something unfamiliar move through them when that sound began. Not courage, not resolve, something colder. It was June, the northern Mesopotamian plain in June. 40,000 Roman soldiers baked inside their armour on an open, featureless plain with no shade, no cover, no wind, and no meaningful source of water within marching distance. The sun did not merely shine, it pressed down on them, a physical weight, heating the iron and bronze of their equipment until it burned to the touch. Men who had trained their whole lives to fight in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, shield locked against shield, were now stationary targets on a killing floor. They had locked into the testudo, the famous Roman tortoise formation, shields raised overhead and packed at the sides, creating a kind of iron shell. Arrows rained down from above at steep angles, punching through the overlapping scooter with a sound like hail on a tin roof. Then through the hands gripping the shields beneath, then through the men. Plutarch described it directly. The Parthian arrows fractured armour and tore their way through every covering alike, whether hard or soft. That is not a literary flourish. That is a clinical description of men screaming. Because the iron-tipped Parthian war arrows, shot from powerful composite recurve bows at full gallop, were not ordinary projectiles. They were engineered to pierce. And the horse archers who fired them, perhaps 9,000 of them, did not stop. They did not charge the Roman formation and expose themselves to the short, brutal efficiency of the Roman gladius. They rode in a continuous sweeping circle around the square, around and around, firing without pause, never closing to melee range. And whenever the Romans thought the storm might end, whenever some desperate soldier dared hope the quivers must be empty by now, a Parthian soldier would glance toward the rear and see what no Roman legionary had yet understood. A massive camel train, standing in the dust behind the Parthian line, each animal loaded with fresh bundles of arrows. There was no end to it. The supply was, for all practical purposes, infinite. Somewhere in the centre of that tortured square, under that killing sky, stood Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Roman world, a member of the first triumvirate, a man who had marched into this desert not because Rome demanded it, not because the Senate had authorized a defensive war, not because Parthia had threatened a single Roman citizen. He had come here for glory. He had come here because Julius Caesar was winning in Gaul, because Pompey the Great had his Mediterranean triumphs carved into the collective memory of Rome, and because Crassus, for all his staggering wealth, had never had a conquest to call his own. Now his son was dead. His army was dying around him, and the arrows kept coming. This is how Rome's greatest financial mind, its most powerful private citizen, the man who had once crushed Spartacus and bent the Republic to his will, met his end, pinned, helpless, and irrelevant, on a nameless Mesopotamian plain in the summer of 53 BC. But to understand how 40,000 soldiers ended up here, you have to go back to Rome, back to the corridors of political obsession, private rivalry, and insatiable ambition, back to the man himself. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born around 115 BC into a respectable senatorial family, the kind of Roman lineage that carried prestige but not yet dominance. His father had served as consul and been awarded a triumph, a man of standing and young. Marcus grew up expecting a life of public service and political competition in a republic that ran on both. Then the civil wars of Sulla came, and they destroyed everything. His father and brother were killed by the forces of Gaius Marius during the brutal political purges of 87 BC, and Crassus himself spent years in exile in Spain, hiding in a cave on the coast for months, surviving on provisions sent by friends while Rome tore itself apart. That exile shaped him in ways that would echo across the entire ancient world 2 generations later. When Sulla finally won and Crassus emerged from hiding, he came out hungry, not just for security, but for the kind of wealth that no political upheaval could ever touch. He moved through Sulla's proscription lists like a man with a plan, purchasing the confiscated property of executed citizens for almost nothing. He bought burned-down buildings in Rome and rebuilt them, having trained a private workforce of architects and slaves. He owned silver mines. He traded in slaves. But his most audacious venture was the Fire Brigade, a private company of 500 trained men who would arrive at a burning building and only begin fighting the fire after Crassus had negotiated the purchase of the property from its panicking, desperate owner. The Romans had no public fire service. Crassus effectively built one for personal profit, and it worked brilliantly. By the time he was 40, he was worth somewhere in the region of 7,000 talents, a fortune so obscene that Pliny would later record that Crassus believed no man could truly call himself wealthy unless he could personally fund a Roman legion from his own pocket. Just one legion, as a baseline. Honestly, when you sit down and actually think about how he accumulated that wealth, buying prescribed properties, extorting burning homeowners, you realize this wasn't just ambition. This was predatory genius operating inside a completely dysfunctional system. He was Rome's first real oligarch, in the modern sense of the word. Wealth, though, was not enough. It was never enough. Because Rome in the 1st century BC was not a society that awarded its highest honours to the richest man in the room. The Roman conception of greatness was fundamentally military. The triumph, the formal procession through Rome's streets, the victor on his chariot, the captives in chains, the crowds roaring, that was the ultimate social currency. And Crassus did not have one, not a real one. He had crushed Spartacus in 71 BC, yes. He had fought a grinding, costly campaign across southern Italy against the slave rebellion that had humiliated Rome for 2 years, and he had finished it with brutal efficiency, crucifying 6,000 of Spartacus's men along the entire length of the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a line of crosses stretching over 100 miles as a demonstration of Roman power. Crassus earned a lesser triumph, an ovation for that campaign. But Pompey arrived from Spain at the very end of the war, mopped up a few thousand fleeing survivors, and had the audacity to claim in his dispatches to the Senate that he had extirpated the roots of the war. Pompey, not Crassus, got the full military triumph. The glory, as always, went elsewhere. Then there was Caesar. By the mid-50s BC, Caesar's dispatches from Gaul were arriving in Rome describing conquests so vast and victories so total that they strained the imagination. An entire civilization conquered. Tribes that Romans had never heard of, broken and subjugated. The English Channel crossed. Britain itself touched. While Crassus sat in Rome, counting his money and navigating the Senate's endlessly shifting factions, Caesar was building the kind of legendary military reputation that would outlive republics and empires both. Crassus could buy Caesar, and at times had, lending him enormous sums when the future dictator was drowning in debt, but he could not buy what Caesar was becoming. This is the psychological engine that drove everything that followed. Not simple greed, though greed was absolutely part of it. It was the particular torture of a brilliant, driven man who possessed nearly every form of worldly power Rome could offer, and yet remained, in the most important Roman measure, second-rate. He had the money, he had the political network, he had helped form the most powerful unofficial alliance in the Republic's history, and still, when Romans talked about great men, they talked about Pompey and Caesar. In 60 BC, the three men formalized their arrangement, the informal political alliance historians would later call the First Triumvirate, binding themselves together by mutual self-interest, shared enmity toward the Senate's conservative faction, and the understanding that each needed what the others had. Caesar needed money and political protection. Crassus had both. Pompey needed legislative validation for his eastern settlement agreements. Both Crassus and Caesar could deliver votes, and Crassus needed the political weight that association with two of Rome's most popular commanders could provide. Together, they effectively ran the Republic for most of the decade, controlling elections, manipulating the courts, and brushing aside opposition with a casualness that horrified traditionalists. But the alliance was always unstable. Pompey and Crassus had despised each other for years, a rivalry stretching back to their simultaneous consulships in 70 BC. where they had been forced to govern together while barely concealing their mutual contempt. Even with Caesar as mediator, the partnership held together primarily through calculation rather than friendship. And as Caesar's Gallic campaigns produced one spectacular dispatch after another, the balance of prestige within the triumvirate shifted in ways that Crassus watched with increasing unease. At the Conference of Lucca in 56 BC, a private meeting of the three principals in northern Italy that effectively redrew the political map of Rome, new arrangements were made. Crassus and Pompey would serve as co-consuls again in 55 BC. Afterward, each would receive a lucrative provincial command. Pompey got Spain, Crassus got Syria. Syria was not the goal. Syria was the door, because east of Syria lay Parthia, and east of Parthia, in the imagination of any Roman with classical education, lay the memory of Alexander the Great, who had marched all the way to India, who had conquered Persia and Mesopotamia and Bactria, and everything between. Crassus heard that the Parthians were exceedingly wealthy. He had received reports suggesting their king, Orodes II, would be easy to capture. He had never personally encountered the Parthian military, had never studied their tactics in any serious depth, and had received no formal commission from the Senate for an offensive war in the east. Pompey had actually negotiated treaties with the Parthians. Those treaties existed. They had legal force under Roman law. Crassus ignored them entirely. He left Rome in November 55 BC, and the departure itself was a bad omen by any Roman reckoning. The tribune Attius Capito attempted to have him arrested at the city gates, invoking religious law against an unauthorized war. When that failed, Capito stood at the city limits and pronounced formal curses against Crassus and his campaign, the kind of public ritual imprecation that deeply superstitious Roman soldiers took very seriously. The army marched out under a cloud that never fully lifted. Plutarch records that the omens surrounding the campaign were, from beginning to end, unmistakably terrible. Sacred chickens that refused to eat before crossings, sacrificed animals whose livers appeared diseased or absent, standards that fell in the mud, an eagle standard that turned backward of its own accord as the army left Syria for the final time. But Crassus was 62 years old and running out of time, and a man who has spent decades watching others collect glory does not slow down easily. He crossed the Euphrates into Parthian territory in early 54 BC, making an initial reconnaissance into Mesopotamia that went well enough. The local population was not universally loyal to the Parthian king, and several Greek-speaking cities opened their gates without resistance. He installed garrisons, collected tribute, and looted temples with the same systematic efficiency he had applied to Rome's property market. Then he pulled back to Syria for the winter, waiting for his son Publius, who was serving under Caesar in Gaul, to arrive with a detachment of battle-hardened Gallic cavalry. It was during this winter pause that a Parthian envoy arrived at his headquarters, the ambassador's. Message was delivered with the controlled contempt of a diplomat who already knew the outcome. Was this invasion sanctioned by Rome, or was this Crassus acting personally? If it was personal, Parthia would be merciful to the soldiers following him against their interests. If it was official Roman policy, then Parthia would fight with everything it had. Crassus replied, with the confidence of a man who had never lost, that he would give his answer in Seleucia, the Parthian western capital deep in Mesopotamia. The envoy paused, looked down at the palm of his own hand, and said, "Hair will grow here before you see Seleucia." Plutarch preserved that line. Cassius Dio preserved it. Both thought it was worth keeping for posterity. I think about that exchange a lot, honestly. This Parthian diplomat alone in a Roman camp, completely surrounded, delivering what amounted to a death sentence to the most powerful man in the room, and doing it with a contemptuous glance at his own palm. That was not a man who was afraid. That was a man who already knew what was coming. By spring 53 BC, Crassus had assembled a formidable force by almost any conventional measurement. 7 legions, roughly 28,000 heavy infantry, formed the backbone of the army. These were supplemented by 4,000 light infantry and an assortment of cavalry units, around 4,000 horse in total, including 1,000 Gallic horsemen Publius had brought from Caesar's campaigns in the north. Arab auxiliaries numbering around 6,000 were attached to the column as well, though their loyalty to the enterprise was, as it turned out, negligible. He had engineers, supply trains, and the organizational infrastructure that the Roman military system had refined over centuries. On paper, it was an army capable of fighting almost anything the ancient world could field against it. What it was not capable of, and what no Roman general of this period had genuinely thought through, was sustained desert warfare against an enemy who had no intention of fighting the kind of battle Rome had always fought. The Roman military system was built on a central premise: close with the enemy, hold the line, and let the disciplined, heavily armed infantry do what it had always done. The Roman legionary was arguably the finest close combat foot soldier the ancient world had ever produced. His equipment, his training, his tactical doctrine, everything was optimized for the bloody intimacy of melee engagement. Take that away from him, force him to stand stationary on open ground under missile attack from mobile cavalry he cannot reach and cannot run from, and you have not neutralized his strengths. You have made them irrelevant. Crassus knew none of this. He had been advised somewhat by Artabazus of Armenia, the Armenian king who sent envoys urging Crassus to march north through Armenia's highland terrain unsuitable for cavalry, terrain where Parthian horse archers would be hobbled by geography, terrain that offered water sources and defensible ground. This was genuinely good strategic advice. Artabazus was prepared to provide 10,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry reinforcements to sweeten the offer. Crassus turned him down. Instead, he listened to a local Arab chieftain named Ariamnes, who assured him that the direct southern route through the Mesopotamian plain was faster, easier, and that the Parthians were far weaker than anyone feared. Ariamnes was working for the Parthians. The Roman column turned south, into the furnace, heading toward the flat and waterless plains where roughly 10,000 Parthian horsemen were already waiting, horse archers and armoured cataphracts both. And at their head rode a man Crassus had never heard of, a young Parthian nobleman, perhaps only 30 years old, from the ancient and powerful Surena family, the man who held the hereditary right to crown Parthian kings. A general of such quiet, devastating brilliance that his own king would eventually have him executed out of jealousy when the war was over. His name was Surena, and he had already set the trap. His full name has not survived. The ancient sources record him only as Surena, a title, a family designation, a rank of hereditary prestige within the Parthian nobility, rather than a personal name. He was the head of the House of Surena, one of the 7 great families of the Parthian Empire, and by tradition the Surena patriarch held a specific, irrevocable ceremonial right. Only he could place the crown on the head of a new Parthian king. 2 years before Carrhae, Surena had exercised exactly that right, placing the crown on Orodes II after helping depose and defeat a rival claimant, Mithridates, the rebellious brother of Orodes II, in a campaign that required fighting in the field, outmaneuvering opposing forces, and ultimately winning a contest of military intelligence against a determined enemy. He was, in other words, not an untested aristocrat handed a command through nepotism. He had already proven himself before Crassus ever crossed the Euphrates. Plutarch wrote that Surena was the most distinguished man of his time in the Parthian Empire after the king himself, that for his family and wealth, and the honour in which he was held, he ranked second in the kingdom, while in courage and capacity he was first. He was young, probably no older than 30 when he faced Crassus. He's described as carrying with him a baggage train of 200 wagons for his concubines, travelling with 1,000 fully armoured cataphracts as personal escort, followed by an even larger body of mounted archers, an entire private army, funded out of his own resources in the Parthian aristocratic tradition, where great noblemen maintained forces of their own retainers loyal to the family as much as to the crown. Plutarch also mentions, somewhat dismissively, that he was considered effeminate in appearance, a note that almost certainly says more about Roman cultural biases than about the man himself. His operational intelligence and battlefield discipline were anything but soft. Personally, I find Surena one of the most compelling and genuinely tragic figures in the whole story. He was a genius who won a crushing, historically decisive victory, saved the Parthian western border from what could have been a devastating Roman penetration, and his king had him executed within a year of the victory out of political jealousy. He never even got to enjoy what he built. That detail lands differently the more you think about it. To understand what Surena brought to Carrhae, you have to understand what the Parthian military system actually was. because it was so radically alien in its nature that nothing in the Roman military mind was conditioned to expect or counter it. The Parthian Empire had no professional standing army in the Roman sense. It had no equivalent to the Roman legion, with its permanent unit, standardized equipment, career officers, and relentless institutional training. What it had instead was a cavalry-based feudal system, an aristocratic warrior class whose families had bred, trained, and maintained horsemen across generations, and who answered the king's call to war with forces of their own raising, equipped to their own standard, ridden on horses that had been bred specifically for war across centuries of deliberate horsemanship culture. The horses themselves, tall, powerful animals from the Iranian plateau, were physically larger than most horses in the Western Mediterranean world. A Roman cavalryman meeting a Parthian heavy horseman for the first time was encountering not just a different military tradition, but an entirely different scale of mounted combat. The Cataphract was the devastating expression of that tradition at its heaviest extreme. Plutarch's description is exact. The Cataphract wore scale or mail armour from the crown of his head down to his thighs, his limbs encased in armour that moved with him, his horse armoured independently with its own layer of scale barding over its chest and flanks. He carried the contos, a heavy cavalry lance somewhere between 3 and 4 metres long, held in 2 hands, designed for a single devastating charge at full gallop that would drive through almost anything that stood in front of it. Against open infantry or lightly equipped cavalry, the Cataphract charge was, for its era, effectively unstoppable. A wall of armoured flesh and iron moving at speed, completely impervious to most projectile weapons, capable of blowing through a formation and turning an ordered line into chaos in a single pass. The visual impact alone was psychologically shattering. When Surena unveiled his cataphracts before the Romans at Carrhae, initially hiding them behind a forward screen of lighter cavalry, then ordering the covering troops to pull aside their concealing cloaks simultaneously to reveal the glittering armour beneath, Plutarch tells us the Romans' hearts sank at the sight of it. The horse archers operated in a completely different register, lighter, faster, covering more ground, but they were the true engine of the Parthian tactical system. These were men who had grown up on horseback, who had been hunting from the saddle since childhood, who could draw a composite recurve bow, a technically sophisticated layered construction of wood, bone and sinew, enormously powerful for its size, while moving at full gallop and deliver an accurate killing shot at range. And crucially, they could do it in retreat. The Parthian shot, the backward-fired arrow loosed at full gallop over the horse's rump while riding away from the enemy, was not a trick or a desperate last resort. It was a practiced combat tactic trained deliberately, used specifically to punish any pursuing force that attempted to chase retreating cavalry. Chase the archers, and they killed you on the way out. Don't chase them, and they simply turned around and kept shooting. There was no good answer from a foot soldier's perspective. Surena understood the Roman tactical system in considerable detail. He had, the sources suggest, studied Roman methods carefully. He knew the legion's strengths, knew the Roman instinct to close with the enemy and end battles at the point of a gladius, knew the Roman legionary was at his most dangerous in the first moments of a melee. The entire Parthian strategy was built around a single, elegant premise. Never let that happen. Keep the distance. Keep moving. Keep shooting. Drain the Romans of water, energy, and hope before ever making contact. And then, when they were compressed, stationary and desperate, roll the cataphracts in against a formation that could no longer move or respond. But all of that required getting the Romans onto the right ground first. And this is where Ariamnes enters the story at full criminal effect. The Arab chieftain had previously cooperated with Pompey during his eastern campaigns, which gave him credibility in Roman eyes. He was a known quantity, a face that Roman officers associated with reliability. Plutarch describes him with barely contained contempt. Cunning, wily, and utterly in the pay of the Parthians when he arrived at Crassus's camp in spring 53 BC. His message was tailored perfectly for his audience. The Parthian army was in retreat, he told Crassus. Surena's forces were scattered, demoralized, far away, pulling back as fast as they could from the overwhelming Roman advance. There was no time to waste on the slow, cautious northern route through Armenia. Every day of delay was a day the enemy used to escape deeper into Parthia. Strike now, directly across the desert, fast and hard, and the whole thing would be over before summer. Crassus wanted to believe him. That is the uncomfortable truth at the centre of all of this. He did not verify the intelligence. He did not send cavalry screens ahead to locate and assess Parthian dispositions. He did not follow up seriously on the Armenian king Artabazus' offer of highland terrain, his own cavalry escort and promised reinforcements of 10,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry. He had his narrative, glorious, swift, profitable conquest, and Ariamnes told him what that narrative required. The army crossed the Euphrates, turned south away from the river, and marched into the open plain. Ariamnes rode alongside for a while, pointing the way, then excused himself on some pretext and vanished permanently into the desert. He was never seen by the Romans again. What followed was arguably a week of the most psychologically corrosive marching in Roman military history, worse in its slow, grinding way than anything that happened on the actual day of battle. The Mesopotamian plain in late spring is not merely hot. It is a landscape that seems constructed specifically to disorient and exhaust, flat in every direction to the absolute limit of vision, no hills, no landmarks, no trees, and the horizon shimmering in the heat haze until it becomes impossible to judge distance accurately. Dust rose in clouds around the column as tens of thousands of feet and hooves churned the dry ground. It settled on everything, on skin, on lips, on armour, inside sandals, inside lungs. Roman soldiers were accustomed to hard marching on the roads and tracks of the Mediterranean world. They were not accustomed to this. Plutarch describes the heat as severe and the plain as utterly devoid of water, and Cassius Dio confirms the army suffered serious water shortages before the battle even began. Crassus's staff grew openly nervous as they moved deeper into the desert without a reliable water supply and without any confirmed intelligence on where the Parthians actually were. His most experienced officer, the quaestor Gaius Cassius Longinus, the same Cassius who would later help plunge a knife into Julius Caesar, repeatedly argued for caution, for keeping the army close to the Euphrates, for securing supply lines and making camp in a defensible position before pushing further. Crassus ignored him, as he had ignored Artabazus, the tribune's curses at Rome's gates, and every cautionary voice from the very beginning of this enterprise. The army marched. It was near the river Balissus, a tributary that provided one of the few water sources on the route, that Roman cavalry scouts finally made contact with the enemy and came galloping back to report. The Parthian advance was coming, they said. It was moving fast, and the ground in front of the Roman column was shaking. Crassus's generals argued furiously over deployment. Some advocated halting at the river to water the men fully before fighting, common military sense that would give the soldiers their best possible condition going into contact. Others argued for immediate engagement before the Parthians could position themselves. Crassus initially spread the army into a long, extended line across the plain, the standard Roman battle formation designed to prevent envelopment of the flanks, and then, apparently alarmed by the cavalry reports of the sheer size of the Parthian mounted force on both sides, reversed the decision and ordered the infantry to form a compact square, with cavalry distributed on the flanks and light troops interspersed. Cohorts were distributed across all four faces of the square. It was a defensive arrangement, not an aggressive one, and it told its own story about the confidence of the Roman command at that moment. Then Surena's screen cavalry pulled their cloaks aside and the Cataphracts were revealed, their armour catching the desert sun across the full breadth of the plain, and whatever remaining composure existed in the Roman ranks was tested at a fundamental level. The war drums started, those deep, alien, resonant Parthian drums described by Plutarch as filling the air with a terrifying sound, like thunder mixed with the roar of some terrible beast. And Surena made his first, careful move. He did not charge. He did not give the Romans the close engagement they needed to function. He sent the Cataphracts forward just far enough to force the Romans to close ranks, pressing them tightly together, compacting the square, making every man inside a more concentrated, stationary, overlapping target. Then, once the square was locked down, he unleashed the horse archers. What happened next lasted the entire day. The horse archers rode in a continuous rotating pattern around the Roman square, never stopping, never coming within gladius range, firing at angles, flat shots at the gaps between shields, high-arcing shots that came down near vertical from above, punching through raised shields and into the hands of the men holding them, into the skulls of men who ducked to look at their feet, into the shoulders of men who tried to throw javelins back and expose themselves for a fraction of a second. There was no safe angle inside that square. The arrows came from all four directions simultaneously, rotating around the perimeter, and the noise, the endless rhythm of hooves and bowstrings and iron on bronze and iron on bone, was continuous and unrelenting and designed, in its own way, to dismantle the mind as much as the body. The Romans held the testudo with professional discipline, but the testudo was never designed for this kind of extended punishment. It is a formation built to endure a short, intense phase of missile fire on the approach to a wall or a fixed defensive position, not to simply exist indefinitely under a storm that had no intention of ending. Arms ached under the constant weight of raised shields. Men stumbled over the dead and dying in the dust at their feet. The heat inside the packed formation, with thousands of bodies pressed together under the June sun on the Mesopotamian plain, was extraordinary. Thirst became agony. Soldiers had marched across a desert for days and now stood in a sealed iron box while the temperature climbed and the arrows kept arriving. Morale did not just suffer. It actively disintegrated at the edges, and only Roman training and unit cohesion held the centre together, barely, and at enormous cost. Crassus sent word to his son Publius, commanding the cavalry on the left, to try to drive off the nearest body of horse archers and relieve the pressure on the infantry, a desperate gamble that, as we will see, Surena had been patiently waiting for. Publius gathered everything he had, 1,300 cavalry, including the 1,000 Gallic horsemen he had brought from Caesar's northern campaigns, plus 500 archers and 8 cohorts of infantry, and charged into the desert. The horse archers did what they had been trained to do. They ran. This is the pivot point of the entire battle, and it is also the point where you can most clearly see Surena's intelligence working at its coldest and most calculated. The Parthian horse archers did not flee in disorder. They retreated in controlled formation, drawing Publius and his cavalry after them across the flat plain, away from the main body of the Roman army, gradually, steadily increasing the distance, staying just far enough ahead to prevent Publius from closing the gap. The young Roman general was experienced, brave, and riding some of the finest cavalry in the Roman world, 1,000 Gallic veterans of Caesar's northern campaigns, hard men who had charged Germanic warbands in the cold rain of northern Europe. He pressed forward harder. The Parthians retreated faster and turned and circled, and the dust rose around the pursuing Romans until visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Publius found himself impossibly far from his father's square, surrounded by a whirling cloud of dust and sound, with no clear view of what lay ahead or behind. Then the Parthians stopped running. The Cataphracts, who had been waiting just over the visual horizon, turned. The horse archers circled back around the flanks of Publius's force, and the trap, which Surena had been constructing since the moment the Roman army left the Euphrates, closed on a smaller scale around one detached Roman force in the dust of the Mesopotamian plain. Publius and his men found themselves doing exactly what the main army was doing, surrounded, under fire, stationary, except they were alone, without the main body's numbers, without any possibility of rescue, with the Cataphracts now pressing in from the front and the horse archers cycling around the outside. Publius ordered a charge against the Cataphracts and watched it fail against armoured horses and armoured men and 12-foot lances. He ordered a retreat to a small sandy hill and tried to form a defensive position there. His Gallic horsemen, fighting with a ferocity that even the ancient sources acknowledge, grabbed the Parthian Cataphract lances with bare hands and tried to drag the riders from their horses. Several apparently dismounted and attacked the armoured horses from below, going for unprotected joints and belly. It was desperate, savage, and entirely futile. Publius Crassus was wounded. His hands were pinned through by arrows. Plutarch is specific about this, the arrows going through his hands and fixing them to his shield. Unable to hold a weapon, surrounded, his force being systematically destroyed around him, Publius ordered one of his own men to kill him rather than be taken alive. He died there, on that nameless rise of sand, somewhere far enough into the desert that his father's square was long since invisible on the horizon. And then, as if the day had not already broken something fundamental inside the Roman camp, a Parthian horseman came riding toward the Roman square. He was carrying something on the tip of his lance. It was Publius's head. The horseman rode along the front of the Roman formation, slowly, deliberately, holding the head up where every man in the square could see it, asking in a loud voice whether they knew whose it was, and whether Crassus's family had distinguished itself in some way. A psychological operation of stunning cold-bloodedness, executed in full view of the surviving Roman square. Tens of thousands of men who had just watched their cavalry disappear into the dust hours earlier and had heard nothing since. Plutarch says that Crassus, upon seeing his son's head displayed, cried out that this grief was his own, that the misfortune of Rome was not so great. After that, the ancient sources suggest whatever Crassus had left of a commander's composure largely left him. He moved through the remaining hours of the battle in something close to a daze, issuing no meaningful orders, making no decisions, leaving his officers to manage what remained of the army's survival as best they could. The arrows did not stop. The sun did not move. And the day that had begun as Crassus's conquest of Parthia became instead the worst Roman military disaster in 200 years, matched only, the ancient sources agree, by what Hannibal had done to Rome at Cannae. 20,000 Romans would die on the field. 10,000 would be taken prisoner and marched east into Parthian captivity, eventually settled at the far eastern edge of the empire at Merv, near the border with Central Asia, living out their lives there, never returning home. Another 10,000 or so managed to escape into the desert dark as night fell, and Surena, satisfied with the day's work, withdrew. The battle was over. The dying would take a little longer. Before we follow the survivors into the final collapse of this campaign, and before we get to the death of Crassus himself, I want to take 60 seconds to talk about something that, honestly, has nothing to do with the Parthians, but everything to do with staying sharp online in a world that is, in its own way, full of people who want to track your movements and exploit your position. Here's the thing. Crassus walked into a trap partly because he didn't have reliable intelligence. He didn't know who was watching him, who was feeding false information back to his enemies, who was pretending to be on his side while working against him. He had zero operational security, and it cost him everything. Your situation online isn't so different. Every time you connect to public Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, every time you're browsing on an unsecured network, you're essentially marching your personal data into an open plain with no water and no cover. NordVPN changes that. It encrypts your internet connection, hides your IP address, and keeps your browsing activity private from anyone who might be watching. Advertisers, third parties, or anybody else lurking in the network. It also lets you access content from servers in over 110 countries, which for history nerds like us means getting around regional restrictions to watch documentaries, access archives, and stream content that isn't always available where you are. I use it myself. It's fast, it's reliable, and the setup takes about 2 minutes. Go to NordVPN to get a huge discount on your plan, plus 4 extra months for free. The link is always in the description below. Now, back to the killing field. The sun was fully up, blazing straight down from a sky that offered absolutely no mercy by the time the second phase of the battle began. There was no dramatic signal, no bugle call marking a change in Surena's strategy. The change was almost imperceptible from inside the Roman square, which is part of what made it so devastating. It was simply that the arrows, already falling for hours, began to fall differently, more concentrated, more deliberate. Plutarch's account describes the Roman formation pressing tighter and tighter, together as men dropped in the outer ranks, the soldiers behind them stepping forward to close the gaps, the square shrinking almost organically as its perimeter contracted. Dead men lay where they fell in the dust, and their comrades stepped over them or onto them, still holding their shields up, still trying to maintain the geometry of the formation that was the only thing standing between them and total dissolution. The testudo formation was, under most circumstances, an impressive engineering achievement in human organization. Roman legionaries had drilled it until it was reflexive, shields locked overhead in a continuous surface, the front rows facing out with shields vertical at shin height, the side and rear ranks turned outward with shields presented to their respective directions, every gap closed, every angle covered. Against ordinary arrow fire from a stationary enemy shooting at a predictable range, it worked. The problem, as Cassius Dio recorded with the clarity of a man who had studied the battle carefully, was that it created a perfect contradiction at Carrhae. When the Romans locked shields tightly enough to stop arrows, the Cataphracts charged and punched through the dense, slow-moving formation with their long lances, and when they loosened ranks to allow the mobility to resist the cataphract charge, the arrows came straight through the gaps and killed men where they stood. There was no configuration that worked against both threats simultaneously. It was not bad luck. It was deliberate system design by a general who had thought every angle through in advance. The psychological dimension of this trap is something that I think gets underemphasized in most tellings of the battle, and it really shouldn't. These were Roman legionaries, men with perhaps the most formidable institutional culture of military discipline and unit cohesion in the ancient world. The Roman training system, the legion's tradition of professional pride, the social bonds between soldiers who had served together for years, all of that was real, and all of it was tested to its absolute breaking point and then slightly beyond over the course of that day. Because the Parthian system was designed not just to kill Romans, but to make them feel the specific grinding horror of helplessness, the knowledge that you cannot reach your enemy, cannot make him stop, cannot make him pay for what he is doing to you. You can only absorb it, and absorb it, and absorb it, and hope it ends. By the time Publius's head was carried before the Roman square, the battle had changed from a contest into a calculation. Crassus had already seen the camel train behind Surena's line, the proof that the arrow storm was not running out. Publius's charge had been the desperate answer to that revelation, and its destruction removed the last mobile force the Romans possessed. What remained was a compact Roman square on open ground, thirsty, wounded, and surrounded by an enemy that could choose every distance and every tempo. From inside the formation, the cruelty of Surena's system was that nothing dramatic needed to happen next. There was no single breakthrough, no heroic collapse, no clean moment when the battle could be said to turn. It turned by inches, one shield arm failing, one wounded man stumbling, one gap opening, one exhausted rank closing over the dead. The Romans were still disciplined enough to hold together, but every minute of discipline cost them more strength and more hope. This is where the battle became almost mechanical. The Parthians did not need to rush. They had arrows, they had horses, they had water and distance. The Romans had courage, training, and a formation that could delay death but not solve the problem in front of it. As the afternoon dragged on, Surena kept the pressure exactly where it needed to be. Close enough to prevent escape, distant enough to deny revenge. The arrows resumed and did not stop again, until the sun began its descent and the light shifted from white-hot to bronze. The Roman square held. That much must be said clearly. Under conditions of extraordinary suffering, thirst, heat, wounds, exhaustion, grief, and fear, the legionaries maintained their formation through an entire afternoon of continuous missile fire. That is not nothing. That is, in its own terrible way, a testament to the Roman military system working exactly as it was designed to work, extracting maximum performance from men in conditions that should have produced the rout. They held, they bled, they died in place. By the time Surena chose to disengage as evening came, and the light became unsuitable for accurate archery, the Roman army had lost somewhere in the range of 10,000 men killed during the battle itself, with another large portion wounded to varying degrees. The 4,000 wounded men who could not march were the ones who suffered the most in the coming hours, though they did not yet know it. As night fell and Crassus's surviving officers gathered in grim consultation, the decision they reached was the only rational one available, and also the most morally hideous. They would leave the wounded behind. There was no alternative that didn't mean the death of everyone. The wounded could not be carried across the desert at the pace a retreating army needed to maintain. The Parthians, who had withdrawn for the night, would return at dawn with fresh horses and full quivers. Every able-bodied man who could still walk needed to move, now, in the dark, toward the town of Carrhae some miles to the north, where there were walls and water and the possibility of surviving another day. They marched without torches, without drums, without the noise that a Roman night march would ordinarily permit. 4,000 wounded men were left in the dust behind them. When Surena returned at dawn, he killed them where they lay. Plutarch's account does not linger on this. Neither does Cassius Dio. Both historians state it as a fact, briefly, and move on, because in the context of the catastrophe, it was simply one more entry in a ledger that had long since become unmanageable. But 4,000 men, left behind in the dark by comrades who had no choice, dying alone at dawn in a desert they had marched into on the promise of someone else's glory. That detail lodges in the mind differently than the battle's aggregate numbers. It has a specific, intimate weight. The survivors who reached Carrhae found themselves in a walled town that offered shelter and water, but no genuine solution to their strategic situation. They were deep in hostile territory, days from the Euphrates, with no cavalry to speak of, thousands of wounded requiring care, a command structure in psychological collapse, and a Parthian general who had just demonstrated that he could destroy them at will in the open field. Carrhae had walls. Walls were better than the open plain. They were not a path home. Cassius Longinus, whose advice had been correct at every stage of the campaign, and ignored at every stage, emerged in these final days as the only Roman commander still operating with clarity. He organised a group of roughly 500 cavalry and slipped out of Carrhae separately, making for Syria by a different route, and got through. He reached the province intact, organised its defences against Parthian raiding parties, and saved Roman Syria from what might otherwise have been a catastrophic sequel to Carrhae. His survival meant that the Republic would have at least one competent officer to hold the eastern frontier. Years later, of course, he would put that same cold, practical, tactical intelligence to work in a Roman forum on the Ides of March. But that is another story. The remaining Roman force attempted a night march northward from Carrhae toward the Armenian highlands, guided by a local man who either got lost, as Plutarch charitably suggests, or deliberately led the Romans in the wrong direction. The army split in the confusion of the dark, some reaching high ground, some becoming separated, some being caught on the plain by Parthian cavalry at dawn and cut down. The scattered remnants of what had once been the most powerful privately funded military expedition in the Roman Republic's history stumbled northward in fragments, each group choosing between the slim chance of escape and the arithmetic certainty of what awaited them if they stopped. Crassus, with a small force around him, reached the hills but found that Surena was not finished. A message arrived, courteous, formal, suggesting that the Parthian king Orodes wished to negotiate terms, that if Crassus would come down from the hills, a meeting could be arranged, a settlement, perhaps a return home. One of the richest and most politically experienced men in the Roman world, a man who had survived Sulla's purges and the chaos of decades in Roman politics, who had made his first fortune by watching other men's desperation and exploiting it before they had time to think. Crassus, in the final hours of his life, did not trust the offer. He resisted it. His own soldiers, who wanted desperately to believe anything that offered survival, pushed him toward it. Octavius, his officer, was perhaps somewhat more suspicious, but in the end Crassus went down to meet Surena on the plain. The Parthian proposal for a parley arrived at the Roman camp on the hills above Carrhae, with the formal courtesies of diplomacy fully intact. Surena sent word, through intermediaries, in measured language, that King Orodes II wished no further Roman blood to be spilled, and that if Crassus would descend from the highlands and meet in person to discuss terms, a mutually acceptable arrangement could be reached. The message was not obviously implausible. Wars of this era did end in negotiations. Commanders did meet under agreed truces. Surena himself had brought writing materials, according to Plutarch, as if genuinely prepared to draft a treaty on the spot. The Parthians had already won everything they could reasonably want from this campaign. There was, on paper, no logical military reason why a settlement couldn't be arranged. Crassus did not believe it. That much is clear in the ancient sources, and it is one of the few moments in the entire catastrophe where his instinct was correct. He argued against going. He told his officers he did not trust the offer. He asked what guarantee they could possibly have that the meeting would be safe. And his soldiers, frightened, exhausted, shattered men who had watched half their army die over the preceding days, and who desperately wanted anything that looked like a path home, effectively mutinied. Plutarch and Cassius Dio both describe the soldiers shouting at Crassus, threatening him, demanding he go down and make the peace. His officer Octavius tried to shield him. Another officer named Petronius attempted to negotiate the approach, but the pressure from the ranks was total, and in the end Crassus descended the hill to meet a 30-year-old Parthian general on a flat Mesopotamian plain against his own judgment, because his men gave him no choice. What happened at the meeting itself is reported differently by different sources, and the honest answer is that nobody who was close enough to see it clearly survived to give a completely coherent account. What is agreed across Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and other ancient writers is this. the meeting deteriorated into violence. There was a dispute, possibly over a horse offered by the Parthians, possibly a deliberate physical provocation, and in the brief, chaotic struggle that followed, Crassus was killed. His officer Octavius died fighting beside him. Petronius was wounded. The Parthian version, reported by Dio, is that Crassus was attempting to escape when a junior Parthian officer named Pomaxia III struck him down. The Roman version suggests a more deliberate ambush from the start. The truth, across 2,000 years of distance, is irrecoverable. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Marcus Licinius Crassus, 62 years old, one of the richest men Rome had ever produced, the man who had survived Sulla's purges, crushed Spartacus, bankrolled Caesar's political career, and marched 7 legions into the worst military disaster in 2 centuries of Roman history, died in the dust of a Mesopotamian road during a peace negotiation, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by his own desperation, with no triumph, no glory, and no legacy that he would have recognized as his own. His head and his right hand were cut from his body and carried east to the court of King Orodes II at the Parthian capital. The timing of their arrival was, in its own grim way, perfectly theatrical. Orodes was at that moment at the court of the Armenian king Artabases, the same Artabases who had warned Crassus to march through Armenia, whose advice Crassus had ignored, and who had now prudently made his peace with the Parthian victors, watching a performance of Euripides' tragedy, the Bacchae. Plutarch records that when Crassus's head was brought in, a Greek actor named Jason of Tralles was performing the scene in which Agave, driven mad by the god Dionysus, enters carrying the severed head of her own son Pentheus. Jason of Tralles reportedly picked up the real head of Crassus as a prop and used it in the performance, to the enormous enthusiasm of the assembled Parthian and Armenian court. Whether this was spontaneous theatrical genius or a staged piece of political theatre arranged in advance is an unanswerable question. Either way, the image of it, the richest man in Rome reduced to a stage prop in a Greek tragedy performed at a foreign king's dinner party, captures something so perfectly poetic about the entire arc of the story that it feels almost invented. It wasn't. Plutarch was not an eyewitness. He was writing roughly a century and a half after Carrhae, but he preserves the tradition in unusually vivid detail, and he found it worth keeping in full. Then there is the gold. Cassius Dio records that the Parthians, having discovered the body of Crassus, poured molten gold into his mouth in mockery, because he had set great store by money and had pitied those who could not support a Roman legion from their own personal funds, and this was considered an appropriate reflection of his character. The historian Florus records the same detail. The head was cut off, the right hand taken, and molten gold was poured into his gaping mouth. It is not a detail that every ancient source repeats. Some historians have questioned whether it literally happened, whether it was a later embellishment grafted onto the story because it was simply too symbolically perfect to resist. But the symbolic accuracy of it is itself historically significant, regardless of literal truth. The ancient world understood it as a fitting end. The metaphor was so exact. The man who had measured all of human worth in gold, who had stretched the concept of wealth until it became a pathology, who had sent 40,000 men to die for the private satisfaction of possessing a triumph, filled at last with the thing he had spent his life chasing. Even if a single Parthian soldier never actually melted a coin, the story was true in every way that mattered to the people who first told it. While Crassus's head was performing in a Euripides play, and his reputation was being quietly demolished in Rome, 10,000 Roman soldiers were beginning a very long walk east into captivity. Cassius Dio, Plutarch, and ancient Iranian sources all confirm that the Parthian king Orodes II ordered the prisoners transported to Alexandria Margiana, modern Merv in what is now Turkmenistan, near the northeastern border of the Parthian Empire, where they were settled as a garrison population on the empire's Central Asian frontier. This was not unique treatment for prisoners of war in the ancient world. Resettlement of captured soldiers as border guards was a practical solution to the problem of what to do with thousands of armed men you couldn't feed indefinitely. But for the Romans in that column, marching eastward through Mesopotamia, through Persia, through the Parthian heartland, further from Rome with every step, it was a journey into a life they had never imagined when they crossed the Euphrates behind Crassus's eagles. What became of them in the long run is one of the most tantalizing unresolved puzzles in ancient history. There is a theory, discussed seriously by historians and sourced to Chinese annals, describing a defensive formation at a frontier battle near the city of Jiji in 36 BC, that some of these men or their descendants ended up even further east, eventually captured by Han Chinese forces, and settled in a Gansu province village called Lycian, Rome, in ancient Chinese. The evidence is far from conclusive. The Chinese records describe a formation consistent with the testudo, and the village name Lycian appears to derive from an ancient Chinese rendering of Alexandria. But a Y chromosome genetic study of the local Lycian population found them genetically closer to Han Chinese than to any Near Eastern or European population, and concluded that a Roman mercenary origin could not be accepted on current genetic evidence. The Lycian theory remains a fascinating but highly uncertain possibility, not a likely conclusion. Still, the fact that the question can be asked at all, that legionaries who crossed the Euphrates in 53 BC might conceivably have left any trace this far east, is the kind of detail that makes ancient history feel genuinely vertiginous. In Rome, the news of Carrhae arrived like a physical blow, and its political consequences were severe, lasting, and in a real sense irreversible. The three-man equilibrium that had held the Republic in an uneasy stability for nearly a decade was gone. Crassus had been, for all his personal failings and the catastrophic hubris of the Parthian campaign, the third weight on the scale. The man whose wealth and political connections had provided a counterbalance between Caesar's military genius and Pompey's prestige. Without him, the balance simply could not hold. Caesar was in Gaul, conquering at a pace that was rewriting Roman history in real time and building a personal loyalty among his legions that would prove, within 4 years, more powerful than the Republic itself. Pompey was in Rome, increasingly suspicious, increasingly isolated, increasingly persuadable by the Senate conservatives who saw Caesar's growing power as an existential threat. The death of Crassus removed the one man who might plausibly have brokered a compromise, or at least delayed the inevitable confrontation. Livius.org's account of Carrhae's aftermath states it plainly. Crassus's death meant that of the once powerful triumvirate, only Pompey and Caesar remained, and now that there was no one to balance them, the two men were bound to fight a civil war sooner or later. They did. Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, exactly 4 years after Carrhae. Pompey fled Rome without a fight, was hunted to Egypt, and was stabbed to death on a beach by a man who thought killing him would please Caesar. Caesar himself was assassinated in 44 BC, and among the men who drove knives into him in the theatre of Pompey on the Ides of March was Gaius Cassius Longinus, the quaestor who had been right about everything at Carrhae and ignored at every turn. Cassius, who had survived the desert by cutting his own way out, who had held Roman Syria together with 500 cavalry, while his commander died in the dust, who had watched the entire catastrophe unfold from a front row position. His blade on the Ides of March was not unrelated to what he had learned in Mesopotamia, about what happens when one arrogant, powerful man is allowed to pursue private ambition at the expense of everyone around him. The Republic followed Crassus into the desert in its own way. It just took a little longer. And Surena, the most important person in this entire story, the one whose actual military genius determined its outcome more than any other single human being involved, lived precisely long enough to be dangerous to a king's pride. Within months of Carrhae, Orodes II had him executed. The sources are brief on the pretext. He was too popular, too powerful, too capable, commanding a private army whose loyalty to the house of Surena might, at some future moment, exceed its loyalty to the crown. Kings who employed brilliant generals and felt insecure about it solved the problem the same way across every civilization in the ancient world. Surena was perhaps 30 years old when he died. He never received a proper triumph, never received the kind of historical commemoration that a Roman general of equivalent achievement would have been guaranteed. His name isn't even his name. We know him only by his title. Personally, I keep coming back to the gap between what Surena actually accomplished and what he received for it. He took a privately funded force of 10,000 horsemen and dismantled what was by any conventional measure one of the most powerful armies that the Roman Republic had fielded in a generation. He did it without losing a battle, without a strategic error, without wasting his own men unnecessarily. He changed the political history of the Mediterranean world by removing Crassus from the equation and setting in motion the chain of events that would end the Republic, produce the civil wars, and eventually produce the Roman Empire. And then his own king had him killed out of jealousy. History, when it looks at the Battle of Carrhae, tends to focus on Crassus, on his greed, his failure, his poetic end. Surena is the one who actually deserves the chapter. He just never got it. The Roman legionary eagles captured at Carrhae, the sacred standards that no Roman army was supposed to lose, the objects around which Roman military honour was organised, remained in Parthian possession for 33 years. For 3 decades they sat in the Parthian royal treasury, a living symbol of Roman humiliation, while Rome launched 2 further failed campaigns to recover them, including Mark Antony's disastrous Parthian expedition of 36 BC, which cost another substantial Roman army and achieved nothing. It was not until 20 BC, under Augustus Caesar, who had finally brought a stable peace to the Roman world after a century of civil conflict, that the standards were finally returned through negotiation rather than force. Augustus celebrated it as a military victory. He put it on coins. The famous Prima Porta statue, whose breastplate depicts a Parthian soldier returning a Roman standard, became the defining image of that diplomatic triumph. He understood that the return of the Carrhae eagles had a symbolic weight that transcended the actual diplomatic transaction. Rome needed the wound to be officially closed, even if it never entirely healed. The desert plain near Carrhae had no great monument built on it. There was no memorial raised for the 20,000 dead on the Mesopotamian dust, no formal commemoration for the 10,000 men who marched east into captivity and never came home. The town of Carrhae itself, modern Harran in southeastern Turkey, still exists today, a small city on the flat Anatolian plain. Harran's famous beehive houses still stand near the ruins of the old city. And somewhere under the dry ground of the surrounding countryside, in soil that has had more than 2,000 years to compact over them, are the bones of Roman legionaries who crossed the Euphrates on the promise of glory, and found a Parthian afternoon instead. That, as much as anything, is the brutal truth of Carrhae. What Carrhae ultimately teaches, if it teaches anything worth keeping, is something that the ancient world understood and that every subsequent civilization has had to relearn from scratch, that the machinery of great power, when it's fed by private ego rather than genuine strategic necessity, tends to produce private catastrophe at public cost. 40,000 soldiers marched into that desert because one wealthy man wanted a triumph. They were not defending Rome. They were not protecting Roman citizens or Roman territory from any genuine threat. They were instruments of one man's need to be remembered as something more than the person who stood next to Caesar and Pompey. Crassus's greed is the easy part of the story, the molten gold, the humiliation, the poetic justice of it. The harder part, the part that still resonates, is the absolute ordinariness of his motivation. He wanted what men have always wanted: recognition, legacy, the feeling that his life had amounted to something beyond the accumulation of property. He just pursued it in a direction that got 20,000 people killed. Surena pursued his own excellence within the systems available to him, fought brilliantly, won decisively, and was executed for being too good at his job. The 10,000 prisoners walked to the edge of the known world and built lives in the dust of Central Asia, never seeing Rome again. Cassius Longinus survived everything: the desert, the battle, the negotiations, the catastrophe, and lived to be one of the men who ended the Roman Republic, for reasons he probably considered principled, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had been one of the wealthiest men Rome had ever produced, became a prop in a Greek play, a story about what happens to men who confuse the accumulation of gold with the possession of greatness. 2,000 years later, we're still telling it. That's not nothing. If you made it to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This was a long one, and it was one of the most fascinating, disturbing, and ultimately human stories I've had the chance to dig into for this channel. The Battle of Carrhae is one of those moments in history where you can trace a single act of personal ambition, one man's need for glory, and watch it unravel an entire political system. If that kind of deep dive is what you're here for, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's the single biggest thing you can do to help this channel keep producing videos at this length and depth. The algorithm doesn't know what to do with hour-and-a-half deep dives unless real people tell it these videos are worth watching, and you do that by subscribing, by leaving a comment below, even just to tell me what you thought, and by sharing it with anyone you know who loves ancient history. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most? Was it Surena? Was it the prisoners who ended up in Central Asia? Was it Cassius Longinus showing up again on the Ides of March? I read every comment. The next video is already in production. Stay with us. There is a great deal more brutality in the ancient world to work through, and we're only getting started.